Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. This is the second episode of the summary of the Quran, which is going to be done in 30 episodes. I'll just summarize what we did in the last episode. We talked about Surah Al-Fatiha, and I mentioned that it's a dua, it's a prayer, supplication for guidance to the Almighty, and Surah Al-Baqarah in particular and the rest of the Quran also in general are the Almighty's response to that dua that we make. I mentioned that Surah Al-Baqarah has an introductory prelude followed by two parts. The first one addressing the children of Israel, inviting them to have faith in this last book and the last messenger. And then the second part is an invitation to the children of Ishmael, the Muslims, those who have believed in the book, to understand the book properly and to follow its message. We saw that in the first part, children of Israel were asked to submit to God's message and correct their religious concepts, which had gone wrong over the centuries. And that affected their attitude as well towards God's message and the truth. We are now going to start from verse 142. We are done up until verse 141 of Surah Al-Baqarah. Verse 142 begins with a discussion on the Qibla. The Qibla was altered. Muslims pray 5 times a day, and they have to have a certain direction while they are praying, which is the direction that we have towards the Qibla. It was kept for Jerusalem to be the Qibla for the first few months after migration. That was God's wisdom to test the people as to whether they are following the Prophet in true spirit or not. And then, as was the long-term plan, the Qibla was shifted, altered from Jerusalem to Mecca, to the Holy Mosque and the Kaaba. And this raised eyebrows amongst some of the Jews, and they raised this objection. And the Quran preempted by saying that some foolish people from amongst humans would say that what has caused them to change their Qibla from the one that they were directing towards earlier. And the next verse, 143, is a very important verse of the Quran, which mentions the fact that the Almighty has made the messenger of God as his representative for him to deliver the message to the mankind. But the manner it has been arranged is this, that it's his companions, those who by and large belong to the children of Ishmael. They were the ones who were, according to this verse, people in the middle. Ja'alnakum ummatam wasata. On the one side was the Prophet who delivered the message to them and trained them properly. They went through the process of tazkiyah, moral and spiritual purification. And this group of Muslims then delivered this message to the rest of the mankind. So that's what was the role of the children of Ishmael. It was the role of them then. It's still their role because they received this message from their elders. They are the witnesses of God for the rest of the mankind for until the day of judgment. If they perform well according to this expectation, they will get the success of this life and the next life, or else they will be doomed in both lives. In verse 151, the Almighty is telling believers that Kama arsalna fikum rasulam minkum. We have sent the same way as we did it in the case of the children of Israel. We have sent a messenger to you who is reciting our verses to you and is doing your tazkiyah, purifying you, giving you the path to moral and spiritual excellence. And for that purpose, he is giving you the Almighty's law, Sharia, Al-Kitab, and is also giving you the words of wisdom comprising of moral principles as well as uh, beliefs, mention and clarity of beliefs. This is followed by the subsequent verses up to verse 162, which are preparing the believers uh, for the kind of response, reaction, harsh reaction that's going to come from the enemies. The polytheists who would not agree to the plan of the Almighty, and the people of the book. So the Almighty mentions that these people of the book, they are actually hiding the reality that they know that this message is from God, but they're not prepared to let others know about it. And there is going to be a reaction. But don't worry, God is with you. وَلَا تَقُولُوا لِمَنْ يُقْتَلُوا فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ أَمْوَاتٍ. There are going to be battles. Some of you are going to lay down your lives, but don't say about those who die, who are killed in the way of God, that they are dead. Certainly not. They are alive, but you don't understand. You can't perceive their life. And the Almighty also mentions that now that this whole plan is unfolding itself according to the way the Almighty wanted it to, and the message has been delivered to you, and you are now responsible for putting it across to others. God is going to test you. People are going to go against you. And He says, وَلَنَبْلُوَنَّكُمْ بِشَيْءٍ مِّنَ الْخَوْفِ وَالْجُوعِ وَنَقْصٍ مِّنَ الْأَمْوَالِ وَالْأَنفُسِ وَالثَّمَرَاتِ. We're most certainly going to try you, but a little, through fear, min al-khawfi wal-ju, hunger, and through loss of naqsim min al-amwali wal-anfus, loss of wealth, loss of crops, loss of lives, and give good news to those who are steadfast. That is, people who say, when a difficulty, calamity falls upon them, inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un, to God we belong and to Him shall we return. So, after mentioning that possibility, a real possibility that was there around the corner, as an act of enmity that is going to be unleashed upon them by the enemy, the Almighty now begins to mention to the children of Ismail the Sharia, the law that was meant to them to follow. And the very first thing that he mentions is the commitment that Muslims must have for the concept of monotheism, Tawheed. There's only one God, He is the creator, He is running the affairs of this world, He is the sustainer. And therefore, He is the only one who is eligible for worshipping, asking for help. There's nobody else who deserves it. So the Almighty says in verse 163, Wa ilahukum ilahum wahid. Your ilah, your God, your deity is only one God, one deity. La ilaha illahu. There is no other deity. There is no other entity worthy of praying to or worshipping except Him. Huwa Rahmanur Rahim. He is extremely merciful, and His mercy is lasting, it's forever. The next verse, 164, is mentioning the evidence of Tawheed, of the oneness of God, as is to be found from whatever phenomena that we observe around us. So the Quran says, Inna fi khalqis samawati wal ardi wa ikhtilafil layli wan nahar, and goes on to mention a number of different signs in the phenomena of nature. It says, indeed, in the creation of the heavens and the earth, and in the alternating nights and days, and the ships that carry cargo, loads of it, which benefits humans, and what God sends down from the sky, and as a consequence brings back to life the dead soil. And He spreads across living beings, He has spread across living beings all throughout the planet, and in the directing of winds, and in the clouds that He has controlled between the heavens and the earth. There are signs for those people who use their intellect. These are signs of the fact that God is controlling. There's only one God who's doing it, otherwise there would have been chaos. It wouldn't have functioned as smoothly as it's happening now. It's a sign of the fact that God is providing us with all that we need as a consequence of this system working the way it is working. It's a sign of His wisdom. It's a sign of His knowledge. And most significantly, it's a sign of the fact that He is the only master controller of this entire existence. Otherwise, as I said, there won't have been harmony as we find it now. Then the Quran mentions the fact that there are people who are not interested in trying to accept any truth. They just follow what their ancestors have been doing. So the Quran mentions in verse 170, وَإِذَا قِيلَ لَهُمْ, when it is said to them, اتَّبِعُوا مَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ, follow what God has revealed. قَالُوا, they respond by saying, بَلْ نَتَّبِعُوا مَا أَلْفَيْنَا عَلَيْهِ آبَاءَنَا. No, instead we are going to follow only what we found our elders doing. The Quran says, أَوَلَوْ كَانَ آبَاؤُهُمْ لَا يَعْقِلُونَ شَيْئًا وَلَا يَهْتَدُونَ. Is it that they are going to still follow their ancestors even when they didn't used to use their intellect, nor were they guided? So how is it that there are people who have that kind of an attitude? Then we have a very important verse 177, which is the starting point of the detailed description of God's law Sharia that He gave to Muslims at the time when this surah was being revealed in the sequence of events. The way events unfolded themselves, likewise the Almighty responded by giving the relevant, appropriate instructions of His Sharia, of His law for Muslims to follow. This verse 177 is before the beginning of the detailed description of the law, a comprehensive mention of what the Almighty expects from His servants in a nutshell. It begins by saying, لَيْسَ الْبِرَّ أَن تُوَلُّوا وُجُوهَكُمْ قِبَلَ الْمَشْرِقِ وَالْمَغْرِبِ. True loyalty to God and true piety does not require that you just turn your faces towards the east or the west. It's actually referring to the fact that the Jews and the Christians were at odds with each other because one group thought that they need to direct their prayers towards the east, while the other, that is Jews, thought that it should be done towards the west. The Almighty begins by saying that that's not what true piety is comprised of. Instead, وَلَكِنَّ الْبِرَّ مَنْ آمَنَ بِاللَّهِ. God says that the true piety, loyalty, is that of the one who genuinely believes in God and the last day and angels and books and the prophets. And he gives his wealth despite the fact that he loves it and needs it to poor relatives, to orphans, to the needy, the travelers, those who ask for help, as-sa'ilin wa fir riqab, and in freeing slaves whose freedom was restricted. These are the people who establish regular prayers and they give regular minimum zakat, and they are particular about fulfilling their promises whenever they make promises. And particularly, these people are the ones who are steadfast, who persevere in their good cause, in following the right track, despite economic crisis, despite illnesses, and they are also steadfast, they persevere in the battlefield as well if they have to fight for the sake of the Almighty. God says, أُولَٰئِكَ الَّذِينَ صَدَقُوا. These are the people who are truthful in their claim that they are God's true servants, that they are loyal to the Almighty. وَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْمُتَّقُونَ. And these are the people who are indeed God conscious. From this verse onwards, there is then this description of the Almighty's law, His Sharia, in a certain sequence. The first thing that is mentioned is the law that has to do with the sanctity of life, the law of retribution. Then it's followed by the sanctity of wealth, guidance on inheritance. And then we move on to Hajj and Jihad, etc. But before talking about Hajj and Jihad, there is this mention of fasting during the month of Ramadan, because it is through fasting that one is able to get God consciousness. It's a training program which enables an individual to be God conscious. And it's so very important for us to be able to follow the Sharia that we be God conscious, or else it wouldn't be possible to follow God's law. It's only when we are aware of the fact that He is present and we have to be accountable to Him that we remain within our limits. So therefore, this training program is also mentioned while the discussion on God's Sharia is being talked about. After that, we move to the mention of Hajj, which is what most Muslims understandably wanted to do now that they were out from Mecca to Medina, and they had lived in Medina without having the privilege of going to Mecca for years, and they were missing the all-important ibadat, worship, act of worship of Hajj. But when Hajj was mentioned, it was quite obvious that it was not possible to be done at that time, because there were polities who were in charge of the holy city, and they would not allow Muslims to enter the house of God. And therefore, if Muslims would have tried to do it, there would have been obviously a battle that would have taken place. So there is this mention of jihad. Jihad cannot be undertaken unless people contribute their wealth. So contribution towards the cause of God, infaq, was mentioned. When jihad is mentioned, there are going to be people who will get killed. When people get killed, ladies get widowed, children get orphaned. So the Almighty encouraged Muslims to get married to some of these widows. And therefore, there was this mention of Nikah. When Nikah was mentioned, there's obviously this question of termination of Nikah in the form of talaq. So talaq, divorce, is mentioned. When divorce is mentioned, a part of the divorce law has to do with iddat, the counting of the waiting period, which is mentioned as well. And then, because the topic started from jihad, there is this return to the topic of jihad, where is what we are going to end our tonight's presentation. However, in the subsequent episodes, we are going to then talk about, after jihad, faith and how it's acquired and what are the obstacles. And then there is a discussion again on infaq, and it's a brilliant presentation on infaq towards the end of this surah that we shall do tomorrow. And infaq, its antithesis is just the opposite of infaq, is riba, charging interest from people who are in need. And then the Almighty requires that we write our financial contracts, and then this great surah ends with a dua. So now let's move on and take the mentions of important mentions of Sharia one by one. I mentioned that after the mention of the sanctity of life and the sanctity of wealth, there is this discussion on fasting during the month of Ramadan. So the Almighty says in verse 185, He mentions verse 183, believers, kutiba alaykumus siyam, fasting has been prescribed for you, made binding on you, the same way as it was made binding on the earlier people. Why? لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ, so that you become God conscious. You will fast, you will become God conscious, and as a result, you will be able to follow God's Sharia law properly. Okay, but why is it that fasting has been required to be done during the month of Ramadan? That's the subject that has been taken up for clarification in verse 185, where the Almighty says, Shahru Ramadan allazi unzila fihi al-Quran. The month of Ramadan is the month in which the Quran was revealed. Now, what is Quran? The verse goes on to clarify, it's Hudal lin-nas, guidance for the mankind. Mankind needs guidance. We've seen it in the description of Surah Al-Fatiha. And this is an immensely significant blessing of the Almighty. And the verse says that وَبَيِّنَاتٍ مِّنَ الْهُدَى. The Quran is not just a guidance, book of guidance. It's a clear book of guidance. Its different aspects of guidance are bayyinat, very clear. Well, Furqan, and it distinguishes right from wrong. It's a book that gives you confidence once you understand it, that what it is saying is the truth, is correct, and it distinguishes the incorrect, untrue and evil understandings from what are good and true. So the Almighty says that whoever experiences the month of Ramadan, he should fast in it. However, if people are taken ill or they are on a journey or otherwise have some difficulty in fasting, they can do fasting in other days. That is, they'll have to complete the count. And this is done because the Almighty says, Yuridullahu bikumul yusr. He wants ease for you. Wala yuridu bikumul usr. And He doesn't want difficulty for you. And He wants you to complete the count because walitukmilul idda, so that you complete the number of fasts, which is important for everybody because all people need to be God conscious, and this annual training program of God consciousness must continue. وَلِتُكَبِّرُوا اللَّهَ عَلَى مَا هَدَاكُمْ. And He has asked you to fast during the month when the Quran started getting revealed, because He wants you to glorify God for the guidance that He has provided you with. And when we are fasting, we are actually practically glorifying, declaring that God is the greatest. We are hungry, we are thirsty, we can eat, we can drink, but we don't do it. Why? Because God doesn't want us to do it. So God is great. He is the greatest. That's what we do symbolically during the month of Ramadan. وَلَعَلَّكُمْ تَشْكُرُونَ, and so that you may be thankful. So we are thankful to the Almighty, and we express our thankfulness through fasting for the great blessing that He has bestowed upon us in the form of the Quran. And we know when we are doing iftar what gratefulness is, because obviously it's unless you are deprived of God's blessings, you would not realize how important they are. So we fast and we are able to develop, inculcate within us the all-important attribute of gratefulness. Immediately after we finish with the verses on fasting and Ramadan, we have this verse 188 which says that وَلَا تَأْكُلُوا أَمْوَالَكُمْ بَيْنَكُمْ. Don't eat each other's wealth, and do not use your wealth as a bait to attract officials. لِتَأْكُلُوا فَرِيقًا مِّنْ أَمْوَالِ النَّاسِ بِالْبَاطِلِ, so that you could snatch, forcibly take away by force or by tricking a part of the wealth of others unjustifiably. وَأَنْتُمْ تَعْلَمُونَ, and you know that it's wrong. That is, don't indulge yourselves in bribery. And it's obviously in bribery that what you do is that you tempt, you bribe some officials by offering them wealth, and as a consequence you deprive others of their due share. It's mentioned immediately after the mention of fasting during the month of Ramadan, because as we've seen, fasting is expected to inculcate taqwa, God consciousness. And when we become God conscious during the month of Ramadan by fasting, then it is expected from us that we start behaving properly. We mend our ways. So if while fasting or after fasting we again get down to the same old evil ways, then fasting has had no influence on us. Then we move on to the discussion of Hajj. As I said, Hajj was something that all Muslims wanted to do. We still want to do it. And there was this inevitable discussion on jihad as well, because the house of God was occupied by the polities who would not allow Muslims to enter the house. The discussion starts by this question, وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الْأَهِلَّةِ. They ask you about the sacred months. قُلْ هِيَ مَوَاقِيتُ لِلنَّاسِ وَالْحَجِّ. Tell them that they are occasions, times for the benefit of humans and for them to be able to do Hajj. These sacred months are the months which were made sacred because the Almighty wanted to travel for the purpose of doing Hajj and Umrah without fear of any battles, any resistance from robbers and dacoits and other, because there were many in the Arabian Peninsula. But as and when it was announced that there are 4 months which are sacred, Zulqad, Zulhajj, Muharram and Rajab, people stopped fighting no matter who they were, and this enabled people to come and do Hajj. But when we talk about Hajj, there was this possibility of jihad, and the Almighty says, وَقَاتِلُوا فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ الَّذِينَ يُقَاتِلُونَكُمْ. So if you are confronted, you are blocked from going to the house of God, you will have to fight. So fight in the way of God those people who fight you, وَلَا تَعْتَدُوا. But don't go cross limits. Even while fighting, don't go beyond limits, because God doesn't like those who cross limits of morality. While talking about Hajj, there were a few corrections that were made by the Almighty in the manner Hajj was being done. And the Almighty also wanted people to do Hajj in the right spirit. So He mentions the fact that there are some people who, while doing Hajj, they pray, Rabbana atina fid dunya hasana wa ma lahu fil akhirati min khalaq. They go there in Arafat, Muzdalifah, in Mina, and they pray to the Almighty that, oh our Lord, give us goodness in this worldly life. So such people going to have nothing in the life hereafter. They go to the house of God, they do Hajj, and yet they just ask for worldly success. So such people are not going to get any success in the hereafter. However, there are others, وَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ يَقُولُ رَبَّنَا آتِنَا فِي الدُّنْيَا حَسَنَةً وَفِي الْآخِرَةِ حَسَنَةً. There are those who say that, oh God, give us the goodness of this world and goodness of the next world. They are the ones who are going to get the share of good fortunes here as well as there. Then the Almighty mentions the fact that when He created humans, they belong to the same religious understanding, but then they started differing, and God arranged for messengers to be sent, prophets who gave good news to the people who behaved properly and warned those people who were behaving incorrectly, and along with them He sent the book. And the book was given in verse 213. He says, لِيَحْكُمَ بَيْنَ النَّاسِ, so that it should decide amongst humans about the right understanding. فِي مَخْتَلَفُوا لِيَحْكُمَ بَيْنَ النَّاسِ فِي مَخْتَلَفُوا فِي. So that God should decide through the book for humans in matters that they were disagreeing in. We move on and we find that the Quran is mentioning a number of questions that Muslims, new Muslims, were asking regarding the Sharia. He mentions those questions and answers them. Verses 215, 217, 219, 222, they're all in the form of questions and answers. Questions about infaq, spending in the way of God, questions about, we've seen already, the sacred months, questions about the waiting of menstrual periods of women. And there was this other question in verse 219 that was asked, يَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الْخَمْرِ وَالْمَيْسِرِ. They ask you about intoxicating drinks and gambling. This question was necessitated by the fact that it was pretty much obvious that God would not allow intoxicating drinks and gambling. Even when a clear injunction to that effect was not revealed, people could see that round the corner and they were worried. They were worried because there was a tradition in the Arabian society that when there was a drought which caused famine, when people were starving, rich of the society, the rich people, they would get together and they would drink and they would gamble and they would use camels as objects of gambling. Their meat would be won by some people, and those who would win the camel meat, they would distribute generously to the people who would gather around expectantly that they're going to get food from them, from these people. So these people who used to indulge in gambling and in drinking, they were considered very noble people because they were doing a great job. But the Almighty said, "Qul fīhima ithmun kabir." Tell them that in drinking and in gambling, there is great evil, وَمَنَافِعُ لِلنَّاسِ, and there is some benefit for humans as well. وَإِثْمُهُمَا أَكْبَرُ مِنْ نَفْعِهِمَا. However, their sinful effects, their evil aspects are far greater than their benefits, and therefore they are not encouraged, they are not allowed. Then we move on to the mention of Nikah, which is something that's mentioned because there was jihad taking place, people would die, and widowed would need to be married. But in this case as well, the Almighty says that it is important that you don't get married to ladies, and ladies must not get married to men who are not eligible to be married to believers. So he says, وَلَا تَنْكِحُوا الْمُشْرِكَاتِ حَتَّى يُؤْمِنَّا. Don't get married to polytheist women who ascribe partners with God. وَلَأَمَةٌ مُؤْمِنَةٌ. A believing slave girl is far better than a free, well-to-do polytheist lady, even if she impresses you. And likewise has been the instruction given in the case of women. They should not get married to Muslim women, believing women, should not get married to men who are mushrik, who ascribe partners with God, who have polytheistic tendencies. The other condition has been mentioned in Surah Al-Ma'idah, the 5th Surah, verse 5, that if there are men and women who are unchaste, who are indulged in extramarital affairs, a Muslim man or a Muslim woman cannot get married to such people. Thereafter we come to the mention of divorce. And this divorce law is mentioned in elaborate details. It starts from 227 and goes on to verses 243, 242. But even before the mention of divorce law, the Almighty mentions in verse 225, "La yu'akhizukum Allahu bil-laghwi fi aymanikum." God is not going to make you accountable for the oaths that you make unintentionally. You know, there are some people who are in the habit of saying, by God. They don't mean it. So God is not going to hold people accountable for that, even though it's not a great thing to do. وَلَكِنْ يُؤَاخِذُكُمْ بِمَا عَقَّدتُّمُ الْأَيْمَانِ. However, He is going to hold you accountable for the oaths that you take with clear intentions. Now, this, along with another mention in verse 227, one verse later, the Almighty says, وَإِنْ أَزَمُوا الطَّلَاقِ, and if they take a firm decision of giving talaq, divorce, which really means that divorce can only take place if somebody is divorcing his wife intentionally with a clear mind. If somebody doesn't want to divorce and it's just that these words of divorce have slipped out of the tongue, it's not going to make divorce effective. That's the starting point. And then the Almighty goes on to describe the details of what that law is. The basic spirit is that divorce should be avoided as best as far as is possible. It should always be a well thought decision of the husband to give divorce, even when the divorce proceedings are taking place. There should be mutual respect for both. The spouses should respect each other. There should be no insults, and there should be a possibility, even after divorce is given, pronounced with a very clear understanding of there should be a possibility of reconciling, reconsidering. And that is what this period of iddat, waiting period, has to do. It enables the husband to reconsider his decision. The waiting period for the widows is necessitated by the fact that it's important that a lady should not get married after she is widowed to another man unless she has spent 4 months and 10 days, during which it would become clear during this period that she is either pregnant or not. So the father of the child would be clearly certain as a consequence of this waiting period. That's what has been mentioned. Now, this mention of the waiting period is what ends the description of talaq law, the law of divorce and the law for the waiting period for the widows. But while all this is being mentioned, somewhere before the end of this description, we have this verse, verses 238 and 239, surprisingly, which talk about prayers. And the Almighty says, وَحَافِظُوا عَلَى الصَّلَوَاتِ, and protect your prayers. وَالصَّلَاةُ الْوُسْطَى, particularly the one that comes in the middle. وَقُومُوا لِلَّهِ قَانِتِينَ, and stand before God in submissiveness, submitting to Him. And if you are in a state of fear, still pray your prayers even while walking or sitting and traveling. But prayer you must make. It's the same way as we have seen earlier that the Almighty, while talking about the law, Sharia, He talks about fasting and God consciousness. Likewise, while talking about His law, in the middle He is talking about formal, regular prayers, because in prayers we are reminded of God's presence, and therefore we are expected to pray regularly so that we are His loyal servants, obedient to Him. Finally, the topic that started all this discussion, that is jihad, returns. And what we find from verse 243 to verse 251 is a mention of a jihad that took place before the revelation of the Quran in the history of the children of Israel. That was the jihad of Talut and Jalut, Saul and Goliath. The Almighty mentions that the children of Israel, the Jews, were large in number, but they were morally weak. So they were as if they were dead. And then they were brought back to life when they corrected themselves morally, and the Almighty gave Talut, Saul, as sovereign, as their king, as the commander-in-chief, and they fought this battle and they defeated the enemy. And this story is obviously there in the Bible as well, but the way the Quran has described is talking about certain things which are different from Bible, and an independent neutral reader would know which of the two descriptions seems to be making more sense. But the fact that the Quranic description is similar but different in some ways to what has been mentioned in Bible is a refutation of the fact that it's copied from there, that it's a plagiarized version of the Bible. And that is what the Almighty is pointing out towards the very end in verse 252. Tilka ayatullahi natluha alayka bil haqq. These are the verses of God that we are reciting to you, O Prophet, in truth. They are truly from God. Wa innaka laminal mursaleen, and most certainly you are amongst the messengers. That is the only explanation, plausible explanation, that you have been able to come up with a story of Saul and Goliath so clearly, so convincingly, is without having any resources of finding the story out. Otherwise, the only explanation is that you are the messenger of God. We'll continue with the mentioned description of Surah Al-Baqarah in the next episode. May the Almighty enable us to understand His book properly, and may He give us the motivation, the inclination to act upon it and to follow it as best as we can.